The White House is revealing the president's 2020 budget proposal, where he will request billions of dollars for border wall funding. He's asking for an additional $8.6 billion to build more than 700 miles of barrier along the southern border by cutting domestic programs to pay for it. It's a move that's expected to reignite his fight with Democratic congressional leaders, which led to the record-breaking partial government shutdown earlier this year. So for more on this, we want to bring in CBS News chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett. Okay, so there are, different components to this budget proposal. Let's start with this border wall funding, because that's what I started talking about.
Sure.
It sounds like pretty much the same amount of money that he was asking for before that led to a government shutdown.
It is, and the administration makes the point that if this $8.6 billion is secured, taking all the money that was originally appropriated in the first 2 years of the Trump presidency and the emergency declaration funds, if all of those are secured, there will be enough to complete that 722 miles of border barrier. And the administration likes to point out the president has backed away from that idea of having a wall from one end of the U.S.-Mexico border to another, but essentially these 722 miles are in the designated high trafficking areas identified by the Border Patrol and ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement. So the administration says these are areas that the experts have said should be fortified with barriers stronger than the ones that currently exist, and would essentially fulfill the president's promise. One thing that would not be fulfilled: Mexico's not paying for any of it, directly or indirectly, and this budget makes that absolutely clear. This is now a fight between this White House and Congress over all of this funding. And also, Anne-Marie, we should also point out, the federal budget is $4.5 trillion. $8.6 billion is a small fraction of that, but it will garner this day and in the days ahead most of the headlines.
Indeed, perhaps because, as I understand it, within the budget are proposed cuts to a lot of government programs, except for the military. He's asking for more money for the military.
That's right, and we're going to go through the details because the budget was really just released, and because this is kind of a tradition in Washington, if there's divided government, as soon as the budget is released, it's dead. So, as a political matter. So we've had it, it's been launched, and now it's already dead. So as a political matter, the negotiations begin. But the big picture is $4.5 trillion, an increase in defense spending from the current $713 billion to $750. Most budget watchers looking at the Pentagon budget were expecting $733 billion. $750 is a lot more than that, quite obviously, by $17 billion. And while this administration says to Congress, we've got to jack up defense spending, it also is proposing across the board 5% cuts for everything that's not defense and veterans affairs. Veterans gets a 7% boost in this Trump budget. So that is requiring of Congress lots and lots of cuts to lots of other programs not related to Pentagon or Pentagon related or veteran spending. So that means telling a congressional majority in the House, just created by the midterm election, most, if not all, of their domestic priorities, you've got to cut all those, keep all the Trump tax cuts, which you voted against, keep all of the defense increases, add to them, which you're generally skeptical of. You can see why I said just a moment ago, the budget was just born, and now it's already dead.
Indeed. Also, sort of one other element that seems to be thrown in there, $1 billion to support working families. Is that Ivanka Trump's project?
It is. It's one of her projects, and it certainly could be something that might find bipartisan compromise. One thing I'm sort of surprised about in this budget, Anne-Marie, is there isn't any real fanfare about infrastructure. This administration talks about it relentlessly. Congressional Democrats always point to it as this place of possible bipartisan compromise. No real ideas or innovative solutions on that. So I guess that is, again, going to be one of those topics that everyone in Washington points to in theory as a place where there can be bipartisan compromise and real innovation. And yet when the time comes for that to be put on paper, it sort of disappears.
That is a really interesting observation. You know, this is a president who said that he's a great builder. And so that was one of the things that he campaigned on. And you remember, we did have an infrastructure week, but then it got overshadowed by one of, I can't even recall which scandal it got overshadowed by. But I remember it did. Yeah.
But here's the underlying problem. To get to infrastructure, one of the things most of the experts say you have to do is something we haven't done since 1993. Increase the federal gasoline tax. Well, this administration doesn't want to raise taxes. And Democrats say, well, if you're not going to raise taxes to increase the available amount of money for infrastructure, where are we going to get it? And that's sort of the big block. And even though that gas tax, last raised in 1993, could be indexed to inflation just so it would be the same value that it was back in 1993, plenty of Republicans think that's a tax increase, even though as an economic matter it wouldn't be. It would just equivalent, making it equivalent to what it was in 93. There's no political support for that. That's why infrastructure is always, in theory, something we can work on. But when you get down to the brass tacks, meaning taxation, Republicans run for cover.
I want to bring up something else that we talked about earlier,
Sure.
that this budget is not going to be balanced for 15 years, is it? Right? Yeah, it doesn't
15 years.
15 years, which you said earlier is something that, you know, it's unheard of. This is not something that most presidents or administrations would want to sort of hang their name on. I got to ask you, I mean, does debt even matter anymore? It used to be something that politicians would criticize each other over, but does anyone even care?
Well, the administration says that it cares, but, and in its defense, the acting OMB director, Russ Vought, who will be in the briefing room at 2 o'clock Eastern this afternoon for something I know we'll carry on CBSN, so you can listen to him say this himself. But as a preview, he told reporters here last week, look, we do care about the debt, but we also care about the tax cuts because we believe they generate real economic growth that's helpful to the U.S. economy. We also believe in the president campaigned on increasing defense spending. The budget does that. So those priorities take precedent over the debt. And the one thing that the OMB director, the acting OMB director, will say at the briefing at 2 o'clock is there's lots of proposed mandatory spending reductions in this budget. And that is true. Congress is probably not going to go along with them, and they don't touch the biggest drivers of deficits and debt accumulation, which are Social Security, but principally Medicare. So the president doesn't touch the biggest drivers of deficits and debt. And if this budget were enacted, it would still create a $1 trillion deficit this fiscal year, the one after that. And as you mentioned, Anne Marie, this budget doesn't project balance for 15 years. That's the year of the unicorn in Washington budgeting. I'm just telling you, 15 years. Can you imagine how many presidential elections we'll have between now and 15 years from now?
Yeah.
And congressional elections? I guarantee you, when I first started covering budgeting in Washington in 1990, a very, very long time ago, no one would talk about any kind of budget projection outside of 5 years. Well, about 10 years ago, that got too uncomfortable. So then they kicked it out to 10 years. Well, now the comfort factor is so intense that you got to kick it out another 5 to 15 years. And we are reaching a point of not only mathematical absurdity, but sort of political absurdity as well. Because if you're talking about something you hope to achieve 15 years from now, you might as well not talk about it at all.
Right, exactly. It's like worse than kicking the can down the road. It's kicking the can out into the atmosphere.
As Buzz Lightyear might say, to infinity and beyond.
Indeed. Major Garrett, thank you so much.
You got it.